I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we hear the latest acts of resistance in the occupied territories, report on new deep strikes into Russia, reaching as far as the city formerly called Stalingrad, and discuss deficiencies in military training and how it needs to change.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 31st of January, 2 years and 336 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our senior foreign correspondent, Roland Oliphant, fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College London, Dr. Jade McGlynn, and former tank commander and chemical weapons expert, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. But first, the latest updates from the front lines. Ukraine's aerial campaign against Russia's war machine continues. In yesterday's episode, Dom asked, who knows what tonight's going to bring? And it seems someone was listening, as there were so many drone strikes and explosions in Russia overnight and into this morning that this entire segment could be dedicated to the drone war. One of the most significant attacks targeted a refinery in Volgograd, formerly Stalingrad, of course, over 1,000 kilometres from Kyiv. The Lukoil facility, the sixth largest refinery in Russia, produces gasoline, diesel and aviation fuel. It is the largest petroleum producer in the Southern Federal District, with a capacity of up to 14.8 million tonnes. There's quite striking footage of it ablaze this morning. The key question is, what impact is all of this having? It's difficult to say, but there have been fewer bomber strikes and large-scale strikes this year so far from the Russians, so it would appear that it is having an impact on Russia's ability to wage war already. And bear in mind that this is when they've still got the stockpiles. We don't yet know what impact this could have further down the road. Now, for a broader overview of Ukraine's aerial campaign, do refer to yesterday's episode where Dom summarised the sheer number of Ukrainian strikes into Russia throughout January, the most extensive since the war began. But turning next to the front lines, all eyes remain on Pokrovsk in Donetsk. Russian forces have made multiple gains in recent weeks there, but have yet to fully capture what remains of that city. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Ukrainian forces recently advanced southwest of it, with geolocated footage confirming marginal progress west of Novoavdivka. Russian mill bloggers claim Ukraine has also counterattacked near there. A spokesperson from a Ukrainian National Guard brigade reports that Russian forces in the Pokrovsk sector are relying almost exclusively on infantry assaults with limited vehicle support, Ukrainian drones remaining the most effective weapon in repelling those attacks. Russian assaults continue east of Pokrovsk too, and across multiple settlements in the vicinity. Further north, Russian forces continued offensive operations in the Kupiansk-Borova, Liman and Sviazhsk directions, but failed to make any confirmed advances. In Chasiv Yar, a city also widely reported to be on the brink, Russian forces have advanced along the Dniprovska street in the city centre. Milgoggers claim additional gains near the city and a forested area to the south. In Toretsk, Russian forces advanced into the industrial area in the north amid ongoing assaults. A Ukrainian spokesperson there too reported that Ukrainian strikes are limiting Russia's ability to deploy armoured vehicles near the city, frequently destroying them as they approach their positions. Russian troops are operating in small assault units of 3 to 4 soldiers, attacking in successive waves. They have their own drone operators too, though. The Russian 80th Sparta Separate Reconnaissance Battalion and the Radical Wake Unit of the 1st Motorised Rifle Brigade are reportedly targeting Ukrainian positions near Toretsk. Now, turning to Kursk, Russia, next, Russian forces continued their operations against the salient there, but failed to make any confirmed advances. Meanwhile, Russian drone operators continued to strike Ukrainian positions in Kursk, particularly near Sudza. So, in brief, if we're to round all of this up, Ukraine's drone campaign and ground resistance continue to shape the battlefield, with Russian forces struggling to make decisive gains. As the air war escalates, its long-term impact on Russia's military and financial operations remains a key question of the moment. Another, of course, is about the long-term support the United States will provide. Interestingly, the US military transferred Patriot missiles from Israel to Poland and is expected to deliver these missiles to Ukraine shortly. But there was some frustration this morning at an interview given by the new US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, denouncing Moscow's aggression in Ukraine, but implying it was dishonest to have ever claimed Kyiv was capable of destroying Russia on the battlefield and returning to the pre-2014 state of affairs. He acknowledged that Russia carried out atrocities and horrible things as part of its invasion of Ukraine. That's putting it mildly, I'd say, but voiced doubts about Kyiv's prospects for a complete military victory. To quote him, "But what the dishonesty that's existed is that somehow led people to believe," by the way, this is his clunky phrasing, not mine, "that Ukraine would be able not just to defeat Russia, but destroy Putin, push him all the way back to what the world looked like in 2012 or 2014 because the Russians took Crimea." He then added that the US has been funding a stalemate in a war that set Ukraine back 100 years and then called for a swift resolution. "The energy grid is being wiped out. Someone's going to have to pay for all of this reconstruction. And how many Ukrainians have left Ukraine and are now living in other countries? They may never return. The nation's future hangs in the balance in this regard. Both sides of the conflict will need to make compromises for successful negotiations." Now, in a sense, Rubio is right that the US was funding a stalemate. If we're to read that as a summation of the Biden administration's objective never to seek to defeat Russia on the battlefield, rather to force it into talks from a weaker position, having failed its fundamental objectives of decapitating the Ukrainian state. But he's surely wrong to argue that it was forever impossible to defeat Moscow in the field. Most analysts would disagree with that view now, citing the considerable evidence we have that the Russian army came close to collapse during the Kharkiv counteroffensive in the latter half of 2022. Had the Ukrainians been given what they asked for from the get-go, there is a compelling argument that military victory was possible. It is surely also inaccurate to say that Ukraine has been pushed back 100 years. Ukraine was not even an independent country in 1925. It had been absorbed totally into the Soviet Union. If he means 100 years from its potential had the war not happened, that remains to be seen. Wars are the engines of history, and if a lasting peace could be secured that ensures the end of Russian influence over Ukraine and no longer a possibility of future invasion, there's no reason to think there couldn't be a renaissance of investment in the country, and for many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, perhaps millions, to return home, rebuild, and consecrate a new future as part of the European Western family of nations. One lesson from the 20th century is how quickly countries can rebuild once peace is assured. Just look at Western Europe with the aid of the Marshall Plan. Nothing is predetermined here. The only scenario where Ukraine is definitely pushed back 100 years is if Russia wins. But to end this segment, just to point you all to an interesting piece in the New York Times, a summary of the fate of the North Korean units we reported had been taken from the front lines. It would appear now none are actively engaged in the hottest areas of the front. To quote the piece, Ukrainian troops who have fought against the North Koreans have described them as fierce warriors, but disorganization in their ranks and a lack of cohesion with Russian units has quickly driven up casualties. Since arriving on the battlefield, the North Korean soldiers have been left to fend for themselves, advancing with few armoured vehicles and rarely pausing to regroup or fall back. That comes directly from Kyiv's frontline troops. So a neat summary there of the failure of Pyongyang to have a transformative impact on the battlefield beyond its munitions support. But we'll be looking more closely with Hamish shortly into issues in Ukrainian units. But before that, I'm delighted to welcome back onto the podcast Dr. Jade McGlynn, who returns for the second of our new regular segments on violent Ukrainian resistance activities in the occupied territories. Jade, welcome. Today's segment, which you've compiled with your researcher Ilya, thank you both, covers the 14th of January to the 30th of January. So we'll be up to date as of this episode. And I know at the end you're going to talk a little bit more about the patterns of non-violent acts of resistance, given feedback from listeners that they're interested in that as well. And thank you all again for your extraordinary feedback to the segment last Friday. But Jade, over to you for your report.
Hello everyone. So based on the analysis of events from the 14th of January 2025 to the 30th of January 2025, we do see a continuation of violent resistance in the occupied territories. Although what's interesting is it's reduced perhaps in reaction to tightening of control there, particularly following harsher rules around passportization, so the forced passportization and making people take Russian passports. But also as well, there have been a number of tightenings of control around the checkpoints between different parts of the occupied territories. So there were 2 successful operations. For example, there was one in Donetsk on the 22nd of January 2025, and this was carried out by Atesh, who are a Crimea-based resistance group, and they carried out an explosion on a military vehicle in Donetsk, and they provided visual evidence, as they always do. Atesh are interesting because they often explain where they are tracking them, provide a lot of photographs, and then sometime later there will be the operation itself, the sabotage or the detonation or the assassination. So there's a real psychological aspect to their work. And in the second case, that was on the 23rd of January in Berdyansk. So just as a reminder, Berdyansk is about 60 miles if you're driving west from Mariupol, so along the coast. And this was an explosion carried out by local partisans targeting the FSB, so Russia's internal security services. And the FSB are largely counter-terrorism division, largely responsible for finding the violent or indeed non-violent resistance. So they carried out an explosion and they killed several FSB officers. The FSB had taken over a local house of culture, which is in a small area on the outskirts of Berdyansk. And provisionally, it seems that there were 2 FSB who died, and there's still one who's in a very critical situation in the hospitals. And there were yet another 3 that received injuries, and there's quite a lot of detail around this. There are 3 other activities, however, they all took place in Russia, which is interesting because definitely at the start, when I began to monitor these, at the start of 2023, this was quite rare. But now, this time, there have even been more in Russia than in Ukraine. So there was in Vyborg, in Moscow, and in Rostov-on-Don, which is closer to the border. So Vyborg is basically the last city if you were going from St. Petersburg to Finland. It used to be part of Finnish Karelia until the wars during World War II between Finland and the Soviet Union. But yes, that's interesting, and I'll keep an eye on that. We do collate those attacks, so perhaps that might be something to discuss further in future.
Well, thank you very much, Jade, for that summary. And I just wanted to ask, because this was something that listeners were intrigued by based on what you said in the first segment that you did last week. Non-violent acts of resistance. Now, I know that for your purposes, you have to focus on violent, otherwise the categories just become too broad. But perhaps you could just give us a little bit of an overview with regard to the kind of acts of non-violent resistance that you see. I know you alluded to the actions of some women last week. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about that and some other cases.
I mean, in a way, the distinction between violent and non-violent resistance is a slightly artificial one on my part because they're often connected, and as well, I guess it depends on one's own definitions. A lot of the non-violent resistance is taking photographs, tracking the movements of Russian armed forces or of Russian security services, and then handing them over by a specific kind of bots or secure encrypted communications to the Ukrainian armed forces, who will then carry out drone attacks. So, I mean, is that non-violent? Is that not violent? Or is it violent? In terms of the more, I suppose, demonstrative non-violent resistance, because there's a whole section as well of, I personally would describe it as non-violent resistance. If you're still at this point refusing to take a Russian passport, I think that requires incredible courage, given the pressures, given your lack of access to even the most basic of social services, should you choose to do so. You know, are you
conducting nonviolent resistance, if you help your children, or indeed if you as a teenager join secret online Ukrainian schools, I would say so very much. But for the purposes of answering your question, I'd say there are two kind of main organizations. I think I referenced them last week. Zla Mavka, which is like evil Mavka, and Mavka is a kind of sprightly figure in Ukrainian folklore, a bit like a mermaid, but for the forest. That's how I would describe it. So she lures people in. And they conduct a range of different non-violent, often very humorous or just slightly off. So, for example, printing fake rubles, leaving them around, and then having pro-Ukrainian messages on them. So it's about, I suppose, keeping that community together and reminding people they're not alone. And Yellow Ribbon, their focus, I mean, the clue is in the name, is they have different templates and people take photos in different parts of the occupied territory saying, you know, Simferopol is Ukraine, Luhansk is Ukraine, or they put up the Yellow Ribbon stickers or templates as they were. And this week there were a couple of really interesting cases, I guess, on both sides. So it was Unity Day on the 22nd of January in Ukraine, and that's a national holiday, commemorates the unification of Ukrainian lands in 1919, which is when the Ukrainian People's Republic signed an act of unification in Kyiv with the West Ukrainian People's Republic. So it's about East and West coming together. And this year, in honor of Unity Day, or День Соборності України, the Yellow Ribbon partisan movement organized a really large-scale campaign in the occupied territory. So resistance members in these areas hung up Ukrainian symbols, they put up stickers, they painted graffiti, and, you know, there was a real presence. What I found interesting is, yes, there's a presence in Kherson, the occupied Kherson region, occupied Zaporizhia region, but I think most of the examples actually came from Crimea. So again, Crimea is a really fascinating place to watch in terms of the resistance. Another interesting element, which I think we'll see more of too, and is also important in terms of understanding the psychological element of the occupied territories, is on the 27th of January, partisans in Melitopol carried out personal campaigns against three very highly placed collaborators who live all next to each other because of the nature of how housing is handed out in the occupied territories, which is purely on favoritism and what you do for the occupiers. And essentially they were warning them that they were likely to have a premature death soon. And regardless of whether or not they do it, I think that constant psychological pressure, it plays an important role, because already Russian soldiers are strongly policed against engaging with the local population from the Russian side. And that's why there has been more of a move towards collaborators, because they are the ones who are ultimately implementing the repressive and sometimes downright horrific policies of the occupation authorities. But it's interesting to see how this psychological pressure grows and works. It's a constant reminder that, you know, you are not welcome here.
Well, thank you very much, Jade, for that update. You'll be back in a fortnight's time to discuss the latest resistance activities in the occupied territories. I should just add, if you missed Jade's first segment on this last Friday, I highly recommend listening to it as she discusses how she compiles the material and why it is valuable. But let's turn now to political updates. Roland, Oliphant, welcome back to Ukraine the Latest. It's been a while, as I know you've been steering with Venetia, our sister podcast, Battle Lines, looking into other global issues and how they impact the US and the wider West. More on that later. But there's lots for us to be getting into here. Shall we start with the latest EU sanctions package against Russia?
Yeah, well, I mean, we might as well start there. So this week, the EU has passed its 16th sanctions package. Now, there's a lot of talk around this saying it was pretty difficult to do. A couple of days ago, it did emerge that LNG was not going to get in there. There had been talk, there'd been a big push from the EU's hawks, from Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, people like that, to get a ban on Russian LNG. That did not get through after other member states talked about. I think the formulation is we're not going to do that until and if we can secure some kind of alternative supply. It was a pretty fraught discussion by the sounds of things. Remember, of course, Donald Trump has made clear he would like Europe to buy more LNG. So there may be a kind of win-win solution there in terms of transatlantic relations if that gets off the ground. But disappointment from the point of view of the really hawkish Ukraine supporters in the EU. There's another row out of this that's developed this morning. So there is, of course, this long running now, I'm not sure how long it's been now, weeks, months, over the end of Russian gas flows through Ukraine. So Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has been on Hungarian state radio today, and he's basically said he will veto the next rollover of EU sanctions, which is in about 6 months from now, unless Brussels helps to start a resupply. So Russian gas exports via the pipelines through Ukraine stopped on January the 1st after Ukraine declined to renew a transit agreement with Russia. You might find that strange. I think it's been something that everybody has found strange, I think even since 2014. But ever since way back in the midst of time now that these wars began, there were gas pipelines running from Russia across Ukraine, often through zones of combat, which were never touched. The gas kept on flowing until Ukraine didn't renew a transit agreement on January 1st. Slovakia and Hungary complaining a lot about that. I'll just give you the quote on the wires from Orban today, speaking on the radio. Among other things, the Commission has promised to sort out the Ukrainians restarting Russian gas transit. If the Commission does not deliver on what we agreed on, then sanctions will be scrapped. Listeners don't need any introduction to kind of Viktor Orban's views on the war, on Ukraine, on the question of Russian energy supply. It is 6 months down the line before that renewal question comes up. So it doesn't mean he's actually going to veto it. It could just be hot air. But it does underscore how increasingly difficult it is. It's always been difficult maintaining that consensus, unanimity in Europe around sanctions. That balancing act obviously continues. Keeping on the economic front slightly, it's quite difficult to keep a finger on the state of the Russian economy, I think, especially when one is not there and when you can't quite trust the statistics come out of Rosstat and other such agencies. Of course, the BBC Steve Rosenberg is there, and it was interesting looking at his read-through of the Russian papers, which he does from time to time, which he pointed out that they're writing quite openly about how difficult things feel there at the moment. So one paper he quoted is Moskovsky Komsomolets. That's one of two big Russian tabloids. It's the slightly more respectable one, or used to be viewed as such. The quote is, "It's a paradox. Official statistics say incomes keep rising, but people can't afford to pay housing and utility bills, go to the dentist and buy medicine." And he picked out another thing, which I think leads us into the broader picture here. Another paper notes that preparations for a Trump-Putin telephone call have been oddly dragged out. And that, to me, is a really interesting part of the past, I don't know, 3 weeks or so. And one of the reasons I haven't been around in Ukraine, the latest France, is because of the arrival of Trump and what that means for the rest of the world. We've all been incredibly busy with this. One of the big questions hanging over the election, Donald Trump's arrival, was what was he going to do about Ukraine? There was all this talk about he's going to end the war in days, that he's going to be on the phone to Putin very, very quickly. Hasn't happened. Instead, a lot of umming and ahhing around there. And a little spat here that I'd like to get into. So Donald Trump, I was going to say tweeted, but of course it's on Truth Social, where there are not retweets, there are retruths. It's got 1,090 retruths, apparently, this tweet. Anyway, this is Donald Trump yesterday evening, basically saying that if BRICS countries, which include Russia, go ahead with a mooted plan to replace the dollar, well, he says the idea is over. We are going to require a commitment from these seemingly hostile countries that they will neither create a new BRICS currency nor back any other currency to replace the mighty US dollar, or they will face 100% tariffs and should expect to say goodbye to selling into the wonderful US economy. They can go and find another sucker nation. There's no chance that BRICS will replace the US dollar in international trade or anywhere else. Now, the Kremlin has commented on this. Dmitry Peskov simply says, "This is not the first time Trump has made such statements. It's not new. There have been reports like this before, back when he was president-elect." He denies that the BRICS is talking about creating a common currency and so on. We have seen that talk, though. That's a little bit disingenuous from Mr. Peskov and perhaps from Mr. Trump, because I think the discussions that had been floated there at the BRICS were always slightly pie in the sky. But I think that underlines I'm not sure how to put it, Francis, but is it tension I think the Trump administration getting to grips with the fact that there is no real easy answer to the question of Russia and Ukraine. And I think that's why we're seeing him be slow to get to these knotty foreign policy problems. He's also been quite slow getting to the question of what to do about Iran and its nuclear program, which completely unrelated to this, but that's something else I've been working on. One more thing I would like to highlight, and that is the American suspension of foreign aid. So one of Donald Trump's early executive orders to order an immediate 3-month freeze on overseas aid spending. It's had an immediate knock-on effect. We've had reports from the Myanmar-Thailand border about US-funded hospitals having to shut down. We've got reports of several HIV clinics in Cape Town, Joburg and Eastern Cape in South Africa, funded by the US government, temporarily closed down after receiving stop work orders. That obviously creates soft power questions about China stepping into that vacuum, but it's also had a hit right on Ukraine itself. And forgive me if you covered this a couple of days ago, Francis, but I've just seen that the Kyiv Independent has launched a fundraiser for 3 fellow Ukrainian news outlets which have been directly affected by this. So essentially, you have a number of, especially frontline newspapers, have been receiving funds that basically originate at USAID, I think, to get out very really important but very small, modest newspapers in frontline towns. And those efforts have been genuinely directly affected by this. So if you look on the Kyiv Independent website, you'll see they've singled out three of these papers. There's one called Sukar in Sumy. There's one called Gwara Media in Kharkiv. There's one called Mikvisti in Mykolaiv. And readers of The Telegraph who've been following our reporting for a long while may remember that I reported on a newspaper down in Orikhiv in Zaporizhia region about a newspaper there that was trying to get a couple of pages of newsprint out for the residents who are surviving on the front line. So that's a big story. It touches all kinds of elements of stuff all over the world, but it has had a direct impact on Ukraine.
Thanks, Roland. I should add that I think I'm right in saying Ukraine was receiving $475 million in energy assistance from US aid. And we plan to return to this issue next week. We've been speaking to lots of organisations and journalists on and off the record about this. It's a very complicated picture and one that does have a very serious impact on the ground. But Hamish, over to you next. Returning to the military theatre, there have been several stories recently, of course, of newly formed Ukrainian army brigades crumbling as they deploy to the front line in some of the most urgent sectors. The 157th Mechanised Brigade was one, the 155th another. Inadequate training is often cited as one of the key reasons. Where do you want to start looking at this issue?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, Francis. Good afternoon, everybody. Absolutely. I don't want to sort of give a spoiler alert too much, but Iona Cleave of the Foreign Desk has been writing a feature, which I think is in tomorrow's paper, about some of these issues, which I've delved into. Certainly in my time in the British Army, I was responsible for training at various levels. And I'll just explain the levels in a minute, from individual to collective to brigade, because I think it's important. But the issue here, as you say, there were 8 new brigades announced to be formed, and 2 that we're looking at. You've already gone into some detail about 155 Mechanised Brigade that suffered badly in December with casualties, and I won't go over that ground. But the issues are the same, and it's very easy, sat here on Salisbury Plain, talking to you and no doubt talking to people in Ukraine. Although I've got the Challenger 2s in the background training, it's very easy to pick holes in what is happening in Ukraine. And that is absolutely not the case at all. But you've just been talking about North Korea and the issues that it has with unable to communicate with its Russian leaders and lack of training. And training is the heart of a lot of things. So these 8 brigades that were developed were the idea was they're completely new. And one of the challenges, they are full of new conscripts and new commanders. Some of these people were probably bank managers or taxi drivers until a few months ago. And then to be thrown into the front line, as you said, in one of the really challenging areas, it's not unsurprising that they have suffered casualties. We understand the casualty rate for 157 Brigade is about 40%, which is massive. They've also suffered from desertion and other problems, and they haven't got the latest equipment. But fundamentally also, they have lacked training, particularly collective training. And I will come back to that in a minute. Although there are some stories of them going to see the trench lines that they're inheriting from others, the trenches, and taking one look and just not wanting to go there. Now, this is a horrific type of warfare, and one can understand if you've had no training that it makes it even worse. And we look at the North Koreans who basically can just advance in a straight line and fire their rifles, which is because they've got no training to be able to work with others, and why their casualty rates are even higher than 157. Trench warfare, I think people think it's dead simple. You just sit there in the trench and fire at the enemy. It's not like that. And all the time you're trying to achieve some advantage over the enemy by what we just term maneuver warfare. You've got to move. If you're static, it's very difficult to make any headway. So when we look at these brigades and the challenge that they're having, training and morale, they go together. But on the training side, we've discussed before in the past the training that is done in the UK, in fact, in my backyard here, of Ukrainian soldiers, individual training. So you have individual training where you train soldiers how to fight, how to march, how to clean their rifles, how to fire their rifles accurately, how to live in the field and survive. And that is the very basics. And that's what they get here in the UK. It takes about 9 weeks. And then they go back. Now, the next part of that is actually to join the training up. So you have individual soldiers who then train as in a platoon, which is the smallest unit of about 30 people, 30 soldiers, and then in a company. And a company usually has 3 or 4 platoons, so can be up to a sort of 120, 140 people. But they then need to be able to train together so that they can maneuver. And that takes a certain amount of time. And once you've done that, what we call subunit training, so a subunit is a company of infantry or a squadron of tanks, you then need to do some collective training, because modern warfare is not just about one soldier fighting another soldier. It's using all the assets that you have to best advantage. And what I'm talking about here is infantry soldiers using tanks to protect them and help them fight, using artillery to suppress the enemy, and of course using drones as well, and air power. But to coordinate all that takes a heck of a lot of time and training. But if you can do it, you can then be a really effective force, especially if you're fighting a force like the North Koreans, who can only go in a straight line and fire a rifle. Now, what appears to be the case is that this collective training, certainly for 157, has just not happened. And these people have had their very basic training, fire a rifle, walk in a straight line sort of thing, and then put in the front line. So it's not unsurprising that they've had issues there. And I think we learnt in the First World War that forming new units, be they battalions of infantry or tank regiments, and then into brigades, unless you have a core of experience in there, it's very difficult to become effective. And with the massive casualty rates in the First World War, that is something that had to be overcome. Now, Britain produced, some people may have heard in the First World War, what we call PALS battalions, where sort of friends all joined together from a certain city and fought together. And when replacements were needed, it was all from their town and environment. And that's one way that they got over it. The other way is to reinforce the brigades that you've already had. And if we look at it again from a sort of British perspective, a British brigade is usually about 5,000 soldiers, whereas a Ukrainian brigade is usually about 2,000. So one of the ways to get around the issues that we've seen with 155 and 157 would be maybe to make those experienced brigades bigger by adding to that. And I'll come back at the end to what actually is now happening. But also on the training side, and we've discussed before Christmas very briefly, there was information coming out of the UK Ministry of Defence that there was consideration to actually do the training not on Salisbury Plain, but actually in Ukraine. And that made a heck of a lot of sense, because certainly you get over the 2 weeks of travel problem. And if people are training in their own backyard, then from a soldier's perspective, you are much more focused on what you're doing. And also, if the UK trainers did the training in Ukraine, they could also help with the collective training, the combined arms training, the infantry and the tanks. Now, we know that this is possible because the Kursk offensive that happened, admittedly now 6 months ago, but also the most recent counterattack into Kursk, was a combined arms maneuver operation that was very successful. So that was conducted in Ukraine. So this can be done. And you can increase tempo. And by increasing tempo is a sort of thing about time and movement. And it's all there to create momentum. I'm full of military cliches. So maybe in the notes to the pod, I need to put an explanation about acronyms. But once you get momentum, which is the sort of go forward, then that sort of breeds success. And nothing breeds success like success. Nothing breeds failure like failure. So really, the sort of so what from all of this, it's not a surprise that these brigades have had a problem. But I understand very recently that President Zelensky has now said that the experiment with these new brigades is now over. And I believe he's ordered that the existing brigades are reinforced and extended. So you've got that experience around you to bring the young soldiers on. But most importantly, the training and this combined arms collective training, which I hope we in Britain will help. And I suppose I would also say, and maybe this is something that not a lot of people would agree with, actually having experts embedded within those brigades to advise, sort of NATO, British experts, would probably help. And this sort of goes right back to the beginning. We have been trying to enable Ukraine to prevail. As Francis, you said, we're all expecting the Trump hurricane to come up with some sort of ceasefire plan and all the rest of it. But in order for Ukraine to get in the front foot in the best position, troops need to enable it to get there. And we, NATO, the West, the UK, necessarily haven't been doing absolutely as we should do. So in summation, to me, it's about training and experience. You need to blend the two together. Untrained soldiers like the North Koreans, really, it is terrible to see it. It is just cannon fodder. It is the meat grinder, as they call it. But without training, it doesn't matter if you're right or wrong, whatever, it makes life very difficult. So that is it. I think Zelensky has made the right decision, and I hope we support him and the Ukraine forces with more and better training, and probably that should happen in Ukraine. Over.
Well, thank you, Hamish, for those reflections on another key subject of the war. Let's go to our final thoughts now. Hamish, over to you first.
Yeah, I think just leading on from what I was talking about, the training and the activities of the new brigades and everything else, with all the talk of ceasefires and all the talk of Trump, I think people have just got to remember outside Ukraine that they have to fight right to the end to get an advantage. And there seems to be a general leaning back and leaning off Ukraine at the moment. And I just hope that ourselves, the UK MOD and others, which I'm sure they are absolutely leaning into this to the very, very last minute so that Ukraine has the most advantage that it can when this ceasefire and negotiation takes place. You've got to fight right to the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Hamish. Now, Roland, you and Venetia Rainey anchor our sister podcast Battle Lines, as I was saying earlier on. And I wonder if you can just give us a summary of what's in today's episode, which, of course, we'll link to in the show notes.
Oh, gosh. Do you know what? It takes so much effort to put stuff in. We only recorded it yesterday. Yes, we have several really interesting topics, I think. We are having a close look at DeepSeek, the new Chinese AI program, which has sent some shockwaves through the commercial Western AI development sector, but also through security circles. There are long-term security implications down the line there. So we take a good look at that. Then there is the doomsday clock. I'm sure most listeners will be familiar with it. That's the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists index for indicating how close the world is to nuclear war. They've been updating it since 1947. It was updated this week. It's moved 1 second closer to midnight. It's now at 89 seconds rather than 90. It is the closest it's ever been. So alarming stuff. My colleague Venetia spoke to one of the guys, a former American general who is on the committee who assess all the reasons for moving that forward. And lastly, we're being able to, I know this is a long, long way from Ukraine, but events in Eastern Congo we've had a look at. We spoke to Dr. Alex Vines, the director of the Africa program at Chatham House. And the reason for that is that I'm sure listeners will have been noting, this takeover of Goma in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. The implications of that go well beyond there. It's causing a lot of tension between governments across the continent. But it's also it's one of the first crises that Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, is being obliged to address. And there are real parallels there, I think for listeners to Ukraine the latest, real interesting parallels between what Rwanda and its President Paul Kagame are accused of doing there and what the Russians did in Crimea and in Donbass in 2014 and 2015. So hopefully worth a listen.
And you can hear a clip from Venetia's interview with one of those atomic scientists now.
1 second, in our estimation, the message it sends was that last year and the previous year we were at 90, closer than we've ever been. And we wanted to indicate this year that we were getting even closer. Once we're this close to midnight, 1 second is a very valuable bit of time. So, while 1 second doesn't sound like much, we're moving closer and closer and closer to midnight. And so that was really what we wanted to transmit to the public, that it's not getting better. It's not even staying the same. It's getting worse.
When you think about the threats of AI and how that factors into the doomsday clock updates, are there particular players, actors in the world, for example, China, that you feel are driving it in a particular direction? Or is it worrisome that different countries are all doing different things?
Well, I think it's both. I think that, different countries have different things that they find important. But your question is exactly the right one. We know from the last election, for instance, that both China and Russia were very active in trying to foster their agendas, trying to impact the U.S. elections. And so in both cases, we worry about their cyber capabilities and their artificial intelligence as it applies to information technologies.
To hear more on that and lots of other subjects relating to global affairs, do check out the link to our sister podcast, Battle Lines, in the show notes. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We're also giving university students globally unlimited access to The Telegraph, completely free of charge. Just visit www.telegraph.co.uk/student-sub. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod at telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.